reflecting on how, at the end of the day, skin color and race still do matter, even regardless of what position one may have in life. So it's been an important year of reflection for me, and an important year of sharing my story with others, and hopefully, ultimately, will be a positive year for everybody in this regard.
Well, that was the TIAA Chief Executive Roger Ferguson speaking with Bloomberg's Jason Kellen on COVID-19's impact on inequality and, of course, the U.S. economy. Look at the Turkish lira. It's been appreciating some 3% versus the dollar after the comments from the president, Mr. Erdogan. He was speaking in Ankara. Extremely interesting, actually, to hear him say, almost a full reversal of what we heard in the past, that he fully supports the new central bank governor and the finance minister. Now, he also said that Turkey is determined to bring down risk and increase return for investors, and I believe on...
Okay, I'm placing an order to buy Japanese yen at 105.442. Order placed to buy at 105.442.
Valuations, particularly, sort of the technology landscape, have gotten to some pretty extraordinary levels. So I think it's not a surprise. I don't think it's any indication of the beginning of the end, but I do think markets don't like uncertainty.
Response.
The outlook for the economy is extraordinarily uncertain and will depend in large part on the success of efforts to keep the virus in check.
They are torturing themselves to explain that they're there, ready, willing, and able.
The Fed has basically done all it can do, with the exception of extreme emergency measures.
Will probably judge this that this is no longer a contested election.
Some clarity around the election and some clarity with a divided government, which I think is actually a great outcome for markets.
The virus and economic growth is more important than the gyrations in D.C.
I think the vaccine, in a way, should be seen as a global fiscal stimulus.
Everything is going to be lower and flatter for longer.
There's just a lot of cash in the sidelines that needs to be put to work.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
going to continue to focus on well into the future. It's not up to me to opine on American political processes or American positions. It's my job to work with our allies and partners around the world to make sure Canadians are doing well, and that's exactly what I've done.
Prime Minister, thank you for being with us.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Prime Minister Trudeau and FT editor Rula Khalaf for that extremely interesting interview. I have to say, one of the most striking lines then was hearing Rula ask Mr. Trudeau, the leader of a G7 country, whether he had anything to say about the prospects for a peaceful transition to power in the United States. Really, you know, just hearing those words spoken was quite something, really. Not something that we'd ever been expecting to talk about, I guess, at the FT or anywhere else. Mr. Trudeau, of course, rather diplomatically skirted that question. Canadians have a great and deserved reputation for being extremely polite and diplomatic, and their leader certainly didn't disappoint on that front there. He thought that the United States would work through it. He also declined rather diplomatically to answer Rula's question, which I think is one that a lot of us have felt about whether he felt relieved that Mr. Biden had actually won the election. And of course, those of you with long memories or even short memories will remember that Mr. Trump called Mr. Trudeau, amongst other things, dishonest, two-faced and weak at times. So I think we can take it as read that Mr. Trudeau actually is quite relieved, but a very interesting interview there on a number of fronts, not least the way that Canada has responded to the pandemic. Very interesting to hear and talk about that. Okay, stay with us because coming up shortly is Managing the Pandemic, our first panel of the day. We'll be back soon.
This is
This is
we ever.
I mean, if you're feeling a bit lost right now, you're in good company. Steer confidently through crisis with the Financial Times.
Welcome back, and a warm welcome to our audiences who are joining us for this session from ft.com and from LinkedIn. Now for our next session on managing a pandemic. Throughout this crisis, each government has taken its own approach to fighting COVID-19, and they've come up with a hugely varied number of responses. And now, as a number of countries are returning to lockdown, we're going to look at what we've learned so far about the virus and how to manage its impact. We're delighted to be joined by a panel of deeply knowledgeable experts for this session. We have Anders Tegnell, the epidemiologist who has overseen Sweden's often controversial approach to the pandemic. Also, Yvonne Doyle, Director of Health Protection at Public Health England. We have Mark Casper, Chief Executive of Thermo Fisher Scientific, one of the biggest global players in COVID testing. They've already shipped more than 100 million PCR tests around the world. And from global boardroom partner NSF International's Global Health Sciences Division, we have Martin Lush, an advisor to government agencies around the world on healthcare and pharmaceuticals. Your moderator for this session is the FT's executive news editor, Barney Jobson.
NSF started as an ambitious idea. Over the last 75 years, thousands of dedicated public health professionals, scientists, and leaders have built upon that original idea and, in fact, expanded upon it.
We've been very busy these days with clients trying to get their products to the market for the coronavirus.
We are actively engaged to keep high the NSF flag.
I'm going to introduce you to the Scrub Club way. First, you get a handful of water.
At NSF International will always be their partner in public health and safety, especially in this time of global pandemic.
Hello and welcome to our stellar group of panelists and our audience, including those joining us on ft.com and through LinkedIn for this particular session. Now, we've all lived through 7 or 8 very difficult months in which we've really seen the limits of our ability to control nature and fight an enemy that thrives on human interaction and policymaking shortcomings. In this session, we're going to be discussing the lessons we've learned about how to tackle the next pandemic and also the next phase of this pandemic. Many of us are again living in lockdown. We don't know how long that's going to last. The second wave hasn't peaked yet, and the numbers about this virus are still sobering. The total of global infections is now nearly 51 million, and the daily death toll from coronavirus around the world is over 700,000. That's higher than the peak it reached in April, so this remains very real. We'll welcome your questions. You can submit questions in the audience via the chat box on the right side of your screen, or if you're on LinkedIn, you can put your questions in the stream there. We'd encourage you to do so. So let's get started with the big news, the big virus news of the week. Positive news from Pfizer and BioNTech that their own coronavirus vaccine has proved to be 90% effective in clinical trials, meaning that 90% of the people who got it developed immunity to the virus. This has generated a euphoric reaction. We've certainly seen that in the stock market. And I'd like to turn first to Yvonne Doyle of Public Health England to ask you, Yvonne, whether you feel that reaction is justified or in any way overblown.
Thank you, Barney. Well, I think it's perfectly understandable that people are looking for hope, and it's been impressive the speed at which these vaccines have been developed. It's one of a series, a number, and I think it is reasonable for us to be optimistic that a vaccine or other vaccines will also appear during this pandemic and will be of use to the population. And there are several things about this that just need to be taken with just some modification. The first thing is that it requires 2 doses, and it will be not available to the mass population quickly, because even if it passes through its various stages of review and then licensing and so on, there will be a priority list of, certainly in the UK, of the population who will be in line to get this first. And that would happen over the coming months. So we're looking at several months. There's quite a logistics involved in getting it out and about, and particularly the transport of this, storage. And we still need to know more about whether it works in people who are asymptomatic and whether it actually prevents transmission or simply protects the individual. But overall, good news.
Yvonne, thank you. Anders, let me turn to you in Sweden. Do you think this means we're now at the beginning of the end of the pandemic, as some have said, or is it a longer road ahead than that?
I can echo a lot of what Yvonne said. I think we have the same
things that we need to understand before we can really say what kind of effect this vaccine will have on the spread of this. No, this is unfortunately not the beginning of the end. This is going to take a long time. I think at least in Sweden, we calculate with what we know we might receive that vaccinating to stop the spread of a pandemic, we're talking at least 6, 7, 8 months before we are there. We hope we can protect our risk groups with this vaccine when it comes, but that will definitely be our first choice. So it will take quite some time before this can really mean something for the restrictions and other things we live under right now.
Thank you. Mark at Thermo Fisher, Yvonne and Anders have mentioned some of the things we don't know about the vaccine yet. Another thing we don't know is how long immunity lasts. How big a question mark is there over how long anyone who's got this vaccine will actually remain protected?
Yeah, from our perspective, our role is to assist in the development and manufacturing of vaccines. And, we're supporting actually about 250 different projects, and we're ready to scale up. In terms of understanding the immunity profile, obviously that's going to be critical because it tells you really whether, this is, the first new tool in the fight against the pandemic, and we need many other tools, or that this tool will be, a tipping point. I just don't think we have any idea yet of what the duration of immunity is. That's a lot of the study work that needs to be completed.
Martin, let's talk a little bit about distribution. We've seen a scramble for access to many of the vaccines that are in development. Just in the last hour, I think the European Union has announced that they've signed a deal.
As you can see, we opened long position right here. I'll show you. Just right here at 105.442.
My family's reaction when the news came through, everybody's going, this is fantastic news, but to echo everybody else's comments, great news, but it should have been accompanied by a very big but. But we still need everybody to comply with social distancing. We still need everybody to wear masks. We still need to abide by the rules and guidance issued by our governmental authorities. So, because there are many challenges, Bonnie, one of which is logistics. Well, a key one of which is how do we evenly distribute this and other vaccines? To Mark's point, or Yvonne's point, this is just one of many vaccines that will be coming through. For the vast majority of people on this call, it will have no impact whatsoever because we won't be getting it, and rightly so. So the question then is, how do we distribute this and other vaccines to people in need and to avoid what we have so far experienced, which is not a global response, it's been a very national response. And if we distribute vaccine nationally, in other words, looking after our own self-interests, rather.
Stop on profit placed at 105.462.
Rather than national protection.
And Martin, let me also ask you about public attitudes. I'll quote a figure from a survey that Pew Research Center did in the United States on people's willingness to get a coronavirus vaccine. They found that 49% of people said they definitely or probably would not choose to be vaccinated. So half people saying they would probably not choose to be vaccinated. Some of those people may be concerned that a vaccine developed at record speed may not be fully safe. Do those people have a legitimate worry there?
Absolutely. And I think first and foremost, we need to not be talking to people who are hesitant about taking a vaccine, but actually listening to them. If people have genuine concerns, we need to understand the reasons why. And I think the debate, Barney, needs to shift from, so far it's been, and understandably so, it's been focused on where is the vaccine, when is it coming? And what hasn't really been debated is the process of vaccination. And we want people to willingly accept vaccines based upon trust. And governments globally need to be really, really focused on how do they build trust, not through their communication or through the communication from scientists, because actually the levels of trust with political leaders and unfortunately members of the scientific community have been eroded considerably. But we've got to figure out a way of how do we engage local leaders, community leaders, religious leaders, student leaders, social media leaders and influencers, people who are trusted by their communities to actually listen to concerns, address those concerns. Otherwise, we will have a vaccine, but we're at risk of not enough people taking it for it to be effective. So the debate it is a very real concern. I think we're late in addressing it. We've got to start now, and it is a process of top down and bottom up, really with a view of listening to concerns, not lecturing people, understanding those concerns, addressing them, and allowing people to make an informed decision based upon knowledge, not being told what to do.
Thank you. Let's turn to the subject of lockdowns and come to you in lockdown again. Sweden is not, you've led Sweden's response, and Sweden's obviously stood out in Europe for not implementing a full legal lockdown at any stage of the process. You predicted back in May, I think, that we'd end up in a second wave. That's what we're experiencing now. You said that by that point, Sweden would have a high level of immunity and a lower number of infections than some of its neighbours. But at the moment, I think Sweden's being hit very hard. Some of our own analysis here at the FT shows that the level of hospitalizations from coronavirus are rising faster in Sweden than anywhere else in Europe. So are we seeing now that your strategy didn't work as you hoped?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, this is really a long-term haul, and what strategy is going to hold all the way and not going to hold all the way still remains to be seen. And I think any strategy you start with constantly has to be adapted. I think the level of population immunity or herd immunity we're going to have and we're going to need to this disease still remains a big mystery, to me at least. It's very difficult to understand how many in a population actually have immunity and who have not. Maybe because it's so unevenly spread in populations. I mean, we know that in certain areas of Stockholm, we have a high level of immunity, in other areas, none at all, basically. So we are adapting our strategy to this. We are keeping mainly the same restrictions in place still. And I think that's more what's important in our strategy, that we're looking for a long haul, that we're looking for a sustainable strategy. And I think that has worked reasonably well so far. And yes, we see the numbers increasing from very low levels. So, I mean, we still have, I think, 75 to 80% of ICU capacity left. So there's a long way to go before we hit any roofs on that. But of course, it's a concern. I think it's rising quicker than many other places because it started rising later in Sweden than in many other places. So it's always difficult to compare countries in this, I would say. But we are concerned. We are trying a lot of things right now to try to slow down the spread. We haven't had a formal lockdown in place, but in many ways, people have acted like there's been a lockdown. We can measure traffic, working from home, many things like that. And we can see that people in Sweden really changed their behaviors quite a lot. And I know there are some European surveys saying that Swedes maybe changed their behaviors even more than people in other countries who had formal lockdowns. And I think I'm understanding a lot of what Martin's saying. That's very much the way we try to work. We're trying to have a dialogue with people, trying to get them understand what are we trying to achieve together and letting them order their life around that. And I think that has been reasonably successful during the summer. Now we have a slight turn down during the fall. We are trying to rectify that by going out, communicating even more, looking into what people now don't completely understand, that they don't seem to completely understand that private parties are also dangerous, not only going to restaurants. And when we're communicating that, we can see responses. It's going to be a long fight for all of us. And I think we're all going to have to adapt as we go along, because there's a lot of things we don't know yet.
One of your counterparts, Anders, in the city of Uppsala, a public health official there, did call recently for a formal national lockdown. Are you open to considering that idea, or are you opposed to it on principle?
No, we're not opposed to anything on principle. I think that's a completely wrong idea to have about this disease. We're trying to adapt as we go along. I think he's worried. I mean, he's the head of the infectious disease clinic. Of course, he's worried seeing more and more patients coming in. We just instituted a new set of regulations and advice to the population in Uppsala 2 weeks ago. We know that's far too early to say anything about that. We can follow attendance to shops, traffic in Uppsala, how many people working at home from Uppsala, and we see all those figures going the right way. People work from home a lot more. They don't go to shops anymore. And we do believe that those changes in behaviors will, in a week or two, also affect the situation in Uppsala. We can see numbers that are stabilizing a little bit by now. But I understand his concern. When you're sitting there at the hospital, remember what happened this spring. Of course, you're worried.
Yvonne, let me turn to you. Do you feel that we now know what kind of lockdown is most effective in reducing transmission? Is it closing non-essential shops? Is it closing pubs and restaurants? Is it schools? Or are we still in the trial and error phase where we're trying to work out what works best?
Well, Barney, I think we're to be humble about this. We are still in a novel virus pandemic. So we're still learning both about the virus and about how people behave and about the interaction of virus with people and so on. So there's a huge amount of learning. And I agree with everyone who said that we've quite some way to go to fully understand this. And the second thing that's come from this discussion is the importance of trust with the population. You must have a partnership with the population. And the more local the actions are, the better in that. And what we've found here is we've learned as the months have gone on, first of all, an awful lot more about how people live their lives. I mean, we in public health, we thought we could work this out from data. Did we know? We know by how the virus has actually found its way into various communities and why. The why is terribly important and what can be done about that. And as the months have gone on, we've seen a much more regional expression of this pandemic, particularly in the north of England. Now, in the spring, it was much more prevalent in London. And we knew that at one stage, about 16% of our population in London had antibodies. That, of course, now has waned. But now, through the summer and the autumn, we're looking at the north and the Midlands of England, and lives are very different in the different regions. And as Anders has said, we have had to evolve our strategies for that. So, some people may question, well, why is it different in, say, Liverpool to the east of England? Well, people are different, the lives are different, the virus has behaved differently there as well. It has found its way into places, and we've had to adapt, and that can be quite difficult to explain. It needs very good communication, but it also needs very good local intelligence. So what we have done particularly better this time is to work with our local authorities, our local directors of public health, and our local Public Health England protection teams, because they know their communities very well, and they know how things play out in different regions. And then working with the scientists nationally to understand what is it that we need to do next to actually slow this virus. So you asked me what has worked. What has worked is a package of measures. There isn't a silver bullet in this. It is terribly important that people do their social distancing and behave in ways that we know scientifically are important, particularly in indoors where ventilation is poor and so on. But also that we have a range of support to people. So why do people not comply? Because sometimes they can't afford to comply. So the furlough schemes and the support to people who are self-employed, or particularly who are on 0 hours contract, has been crucial in the poorer areas to help that compliance. And finally, understanding what people are thinking. So we know in this country there is a good deal of support for the measures that have been undertaken, and people are complying, and they're mainly complying. We need to thank them for doing that because it's hard, and understand those who don't and why that is and how they can be better supported.
Yeah, Martin, let me turn to you just to talk about travel restrictions. New Zealand, of course, is one of the countries that's done very well in controlling the virus. One of the things it did was close its borders very early. In Europe, a lot of us were allowed to go on summer holidays, and it seems that supercharged the second wave. Should we be ready to deploy more bans on international travel to prevent any future pandemics like this one?
I think you rightly point out, Barney, that you look at the regions and the countries who have controlled this well, New Zealand, Australia and others. They took that very bold step, and they are now benefiting from that in terms of reduced cases and GDP returning back to relative normal. So I think we must do the same. And I think on reflection, hindsight's always 2020. We took our foot off the pedal too soon, understandably so. You know, you can understand people's frustrations, but we are paying the price for that now. And I echo everything Yvonne said earlier around, you know, going from that centralized control to regional communication with communities to understand the challenges of lockdown. And I can't really add anything other than what Yvonne already has communicated. But what I will say is lockdowns are only effective, and it leads us into another item on the agenda, if you have effective track, trace, and quarantining procedures. I think people are prepared to take that pain, providing they see benefit long-term in numbers coming down. So lockdown without effective track and trace, and the characteristics of those other countries that have got this under control was they locked down, they shut down international travel, but they all had effective track, trace, quarantining systems. So that is really, really key, because going into this lockdown was different. People are angry, they're frustrated, they are tired. And I struggle, if there's a third lockdown, that's going to be a real push. So the focus must be on how do we implement an effective track, trace, and quarantining system so that we're not here again.
Yeah, thank you. Let's turn to the question of testing and come to you, Mark. Thermo Fisher is obviously one of the biggest players in COVID testing. I think your company has capacity to produce 20 million tests a day. We know that lots of countries have struggled to ramp up their testing capacity. What have been the big bottlenecks, and what can we do to try and loosen those bottlenecks for the future?
Yeah, Barney, in terms of, testing, obviously it is a key part of how you fight the pandemic. Obviously, social distancing, good hygiene, wearing a mask is obviously the most critical. And then testing gives you the information on how do you actually ultimately quarantine or, bring medical treatment that you need. And, a lot of the headlines around testing were in the early phases of the pandemic when there was actually no tests, no capacity, and all of those things. But if you look at it today, we produce 20 million kits a week. We ship to the world. And labs have scaled up their capacity to do PCR testing, which tells you whether or not you have the virus actively. And most countries are able to get what they need, right? Now, there's a question about, are we doing enough testing and should there be more capacity? And I think that's country by country, there's a strategy around that. And I think my own view is those countries that have put a lot of infrastructure in place to be able to test quickly, get good turnaround times, and then ultimately do the track and trace have responded better than those that have struggled to scale up. But I think that the test manufacturers have really ramped up capacity to meet the needs there. And the good news is there's other types of tests for different use cases. There's some of the back to life available type testing. There's antigen testing as well. There's antibody testing to tell whether you had the virus. So the medical community has a lot more available tools to it to understand what's going on.
Well, let me pick up on that point about antigen testing. These are the so-called rapid tests that can often give a result within 10 to 30 minutes because it doesn't require any lab processing. Your PCR tests need to go to the lab. The downside on antigen tests is they're not as reliable. However, they would allow more mass testing. Do you think we should be embracing antigen testing despite the question marks over the reliability?
I think that different test types have different applications, right? And from my view, there have been many countries that have been able to get turnaround the next day on PCR testing. So if you want extraordinary accurate testing, many countries have done that. But there are applications for very quick testing where you want to be able to, screen a patient if they're positive or not, and then do a confirmatory test. So, and there's some back to life aspects of things where, you really do want the information very rapidly and understand that you might be getting 80 or 85% accuracy, which isn't ideal, but it's better than not having any, information. So I'd say there's different use cases from the different test types.
Anders, how about from your perspective, would you like to be able to use antigen tests to get a better picture of immunity, even if they're not perfect?
I mean, maybe not to get a better picture of immunity, but I definitely think there's a role for antigen testing in certain cases. I think like in primary care, where you test people with very mild symptoms, and that if the test is not 100% reliable, maybe not all that important, because if you miss a few, it doesn't really matter too much to the spread or to the patient. So there is definitely a role, and probably in the long term, we need to move the testing out closer to the patients, to the population, which means that they need to go to primary care, and we need to have a quicker turnaround. So I think, and I then definitely think that antigen testing will be what we're going to use in those circumstances in the long term, because once again, this is going to be a long-term race, and we're going to need a lot of tools down the road. And PCR has helped us a lot, but it has special challenges. So I think to have antigen testing as a complement will definitely be useful.
Yvonne, the UK is one of the countries that has struggled in a way to ramp up its testing, but let's look forward. I'm sorry to say that the next pandemic, the cause of it is probably out there already. We just don't know what it is yet. How does the UK or any other country develop the testing infrastructure to be ready for a pandemic that it doesn't even know what it is yet?
Well, the first thing is to learn from this pandemic. And I think there was an early recognition that we needed much more capacity for testing. And that has actually, people keep using this word ramped up, but it has augmented hugely. And, you know, I do commend the test and trace system for that. When a fifth of the population has been tested since May. And there are bigger ambitions to test even more. And I agree, by the way, with the points that Mark and Anders have made, that, you know, the point of care tests can, need to be applied first and foremost in the circumstances for which they're most useful. For instance, workplaces that are critical infrastructure want quick results, not to take the whole workforce out. And, you know, rapid testing is very helpful, but, you know, if there's doubts, then confirmed by PCR. So I think we will get better and better at this. The issue, you know, about where is the next pandemic is a broader question. And it's likely to be a zoonosis, because most of our major problems in the past decade and beyond have been zoonosis. So we need much better collaboration internationally, I think, for surveillance between animal health and human health on surveillance. I think it's very good in countries, but perhaps less so between countries. And this time round, I think we have the opportunity to set that collaboration up. And by the way, I do commend the vaccine collaborations that currently exist, because I think that has allowed us to get where we are at the moment. But we could learn from that too.
Well, you mentioned the subject of international cooperation there, so let's stick with that. This is obviously a common problem, and there are probably common solutions. It's not necessarily been the best example of multilateral cooperation, and indeed the head of the World Health Organization has said that the response has been delayed by the lack of collaboration between countries. We know that the US under President Trump has vowed to withdraw from the World Health Organization, and that President-elect Joe Biden is going to take a very different approach. So Martin, let me ask you, do you think US leadership on this pandemic could actually change things for the whole world?
I do, Barney. I think, you know, there's a commentary the other day that this is the first global crisis that the US has not, unfortunately, taken leadership of, and I think we've missed out as a result of that. But what I find fascinating with the whole of this debate, the debate so far, Barney, is about the treatment and reaction to. You know, we should be really, really focused on prevention. We do not want to be here again. And, you know, the playbook for pandemic prevention is actually pretty straightforward. If we imagined it had 10 chapters, the first 7 chapters would be entitled Prevent, 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 Prevent. You know, we have thousands of microorganisms with pandemic potential, and we've got to address the root causes, and the root cause is climate change. We will fix this pandemic, but unless and the clock is ticking on climate change to the point where we're getting beyond the return on that, to tackle climate change, that tackles the deforestation, that brings animals closer to human beings, that leads to as Yvonne said, those zoonotic infections that lead to pandemics. So that level of prevention requires international collaboration. It requires international knowledge sharing. It requires global leadership and a very big dose of global humility so that we can actually learn from each other. And importantly, institutions that drive this. And no doubt we'll come on to WHO later. Governments change. This, you know, after the Second World War, we put in institutions, WHO, NATO, and so on, to ensure that it never happened again. And the debate needs to shift to How do we ensure we're not here in a year's time saying, the same conference saying, why didn't we learn? So it's about the global collaboration, the global cooperation, making sure that we tackle the root cause of pandemics, namely global warming, and making sure that we have strong institutions so that when governments do change, those institutions remain, so that we're not sat here in a year's time, 2 years' time, because this is going to happen again unless we tackle root cause and put global institutions in place to ensure that the preventive measures are there.
Martin, let me ask you a couple of questions about China. In fact, one member of the audience has asked, what can we learn from the way China's dealt with the pandemic? On top of that, I'll just remind people, of course, that there's been some criticism of China for not disclosing early and comprehensively what it knew about this virus. And my question on that is there a mechanism to force sovereign countries to provide better information sooner when they face a new pathogen like this?
I think the answer has to be yes. The question then is how. And it really comes down to those institutions that the WHO, I think, has done, bearing in mind, with a budget of 2.4 billion, which is the same budget as a city hospital, the WHO has done a reasonably good job given its constraints. However, its legal framework, its ability to influence and direct countries is actually very, very limited. So I think China contained it very, very well. How do we enforce or enable countries, whether it be China, Singapore, or any of the other Asian Pacific countries in future outbreaks? How do we ensure they notify quicker and faster? Then that has to be, in my opinion, driven through whether it be WHO, by actually looking at how we modernize that organization in light of this pandemic to make it more fit for purpose and to fund it correctly.
Yeah. Anders, let me ask you, Sweden has a population of just 10 million people. How is what you're able to do affected by what the biggest powers in the world are doing when it comes to fighting a pandemic?
Of course, I mean, everybody is affected by everybody, and I completely agree. We need to have a strong WHO that helps us in this. And unfortunately, this has not worked, as some of you already said, has not worked very well during this pandemic. I mean, collaboration has not really been there the way it was just in the last pandemic, the swine flu pandemic. The collaboration was a lot better at that time. Exactly why we didn't manage this time, I think that's a political question. I'm not quite sure what the answer would be. Sure, prevention is important, but even with the best prevention in place, still something is going to slip through now and then. And it's not only about prevention, it's also having a management and a way to deal with it on an international level, where we can collaborate a lot better, learn from each other a lot better, collate data a lot better on the international level than we have done so far, because I think we could have learned more quicker if we had been better at collating our data. And we could also learn more about what preventive measures and so on had worked better if we could have worked more together. I don't know if New Zealand and Australia are such a good examples. If you live in a place like Sweden where people travel across the borders all the time, there's no way we can close down Sweden. That would not be sustainable for many months. It will have drastic effects on everything in Sweden, including public health. So we need to find ways around that works without closing our borders. We followed travel during the summer in Sweden. Travel did not seem to affect the spread in Sweden very much. We had a very uneven spread before the summer and an uneven spread after the summer. So there is still a lot of things we don't know, and we don't completely understand why things seem to be working in some places and not in others. It worked well in New Zealand. Iceland now has a major outbreak. So it's a tricky disease in that way because it behaves so different in different contexts the whole time. And that makes very difficult to completely understand what we should do to be able to handle it well. But international cooperation, Sweden has always been a great friend of WHO, and we will continue to be that. And I think we really need to WHO we all want, so we can make it even better in the future.
One of our audience members has asked a question related to that. Do we need a coordinated international system that has a real budget and real emergency powers? That would obviously take things beyond where we are now with the WHO. What do you think, Anders?
I'm not so sure about that, because there will always be countries who will not adhere to that. I mean, we're all sovereign nations. And I mean, this is a constant debate we have in Europe. How much power are we willing as nations to give to some kind of a supranational institutions? And I think we'll keep on questioning that. And we a little bit come back to one said, how important it is to work locally, and to how important it is to sort of really direct and adapt things on the local level. So you need to have a balance. I'm sure we need to have some kind of organism, international, that can help us. But steering, I'm not too sure about. I think that many things need to be steered at the local level, because that's where the political power is, that's where the money is, that's where the resources is. It creates a lot of problems to try to believe that this can be managed on by some kind of, international organization with a lot of power. I don't think we are really ready for that as a global community yet.
Right. Martin, Mark, let's come to you to come back to the question of the next pandemic that may be looming. How do we set up early warning systems, early detection systems, so that we don't get caught out as we have been in the last 7-8 months?
Yeah, from my perspective, let me make a quick comment on collaboration, because it's the one that's not in the headlines. I'll talk about the preparedness. From a multinational company's perspective, right, we're the largest in our industry. And what the practical perspective means, we're also the largest domestic producer in most of the major countries around the world, right? And without the headlines, actually the collaboration to the UK, China, US, Singapore, Germany, etc., it's actually very good. Like when any request we had explaining rationale, governments were actually quite responsive. They understood the interconnected nature of the world and actually coordinated pretty effectively. That's different than sort of the national policy. So actually that early phase of the response actually was very encouraged by, right? When I think about how do you prepare for the next, the thing that surprised me, because we've supported public health labs around the world for forever, is how fragile the infrastructure was, right? And how under-resourced they were. And many countries, one of the roles we did sort of in those first months is we went to universities and borrowed equipment to move them to public health labs to help scale up, right? Something that never in my 25 years of doing this would ever be contemplated, that, there wasn't enough, preparedness, in the national infrastructures around the world to respond. And I think the funding environment there, the basic infrastructure investments, that sharing information across borders is going to need to happen more quickly for this to the next one to get controlled faster. I'd say that would be my observations sitting here in November. I'm sure we'll learn a lot more over the coming months as well.
Yeah. Yvonne, let me turn to you on that point. You're part of the public health infrastructure in the UK. What changes do you think are needed to reinforce, boost that infrastructure so it can be ready for the next pandemic?
Well, there are many things to learn from this one. I think there's no doubt that the infrastructure will be strengthened and will need to be. But also, it goes beyond that. I think we need to build on what has worked, I think, well, but needs perhaps enhancement, which is surveillance, good international surveillance, cooperation with the international health regulations, and international credibility of organizations that can help with that, while strengthening much more the reliability, the reliance on local systems and the trust of local systems to actually give you that local trust with populations as well. I think there are a couple of technologies that have been very interesting. Anders has said about the holidays and how it affected Sweden. Actually, we realized through the use of our genomics that holidays were having a profound effect. During midterm in the spring, we had over 1,400 introductions, separate introductions to the country. And during the summer holidays, again, people love to travel. Countries differ in this way, and they spread around quickly. And the use of some of the technologies to understand the implications of that quickly in populations would be helpful in the future. So I think there are many things, but if I could just have one final word, the way people live for me is a really profound finding of this. And before this epidemic, we were quite worried about the way people are getting their food, the food chain, and how complicated the food chain is if anything goes wrong with it. You know, now we have learned so much about how people's lives have enabled a pandemic to really run rampant. And I think we need to rethink a little bit in the light of climate change, in the light of vulnerabilities, in particular for people living in cities. What can we learn about this to make us more resilient for the future?
Thank you. Martin, I'd like to come to you. We've got a question about Africa, which I think is very relevant. And I know you've advised governments around the world. The question is noting that Africa in general has had a lower mortality rate compared to the number of infections. Do you have any thoughts on why that is and what lessons we might learn from the African experience here?
Probably Yvonne would have a better idea of this than me, Barney, but my understanding is that, you know, the African population, first and foremost, is a lot younger. Unfortunately, you know, decimated by HIV as a continent. So that population probably more robust, more resilient. You know, whether the levels of reporting are adequate, I simply don't know. But I think certainly the demography in Africa is very different, and whether that has had a significant effect, I don't know.
Well, Yvonne, I'll invite you in to offer any thoughts on that, and also throw another question at you from the audience about young people. Has communication with young people been effective enough? The question says we're giving up so much freedom for a virus that hardly impacts us.
To me, Barney.
Yes, to you.
Yes, it is. Right. So it's been really interesting looking at how this virus has played out with young people. I think what I'm looking into the future now about the cost to them and the bills they'll be paying for a long time to come. If we don't have a good recovery, and if we don't actually enable people, particularly with a focus on inequalities, to, you know, ensure that we help people to get back on their feet, that we look at the way people stay healthy, and that we actually encourage a healthy economy as well, because in public health terms, jobs are important for health. Good jobs are important for health. And also we might just want to look at why people put themselves so much at risk during this pandemic to keep themselves afloat. And, you know, what does that say about the nature of work and the future of work?
Thank you, Yvonne. We've got about 4 minutes left, so I've got a final question that I'd like to put to all of you. Let's remember that 12 months ago, very few people were talking about a pandemic like this. Some were epidemiologists, and perhaps they weren't talking loudly enough, or perhaps they were, and they were being ignored. So I'd like to ask you all, what's the thing you're worried about now, that perhaps the threat you're worried about that perhaps is not being talked about enough, that you think the world should be paying more attention to vis-a-vis this pandemic or the next one? Anders, let me start with you on that.
There is, of course, always the unknown. And as I said before, this disease continues to surprise us, and it will probably surprise us again. But right now, I think what we haven't talked too much about is the side effects of lockdowns, all the different measures we have had put in place, and what effect they will have on public health, and how we can alleviate them in the future, not least when we come to the question of equity, because we see that this pandemic, as almost all other diseases, really hits the worst people, the people that are worst off socioeconomically already. And it will most probably make the world less equal in public health as in many other ways after this. And we really need to start working on that, I think, as soon as possible, to stop that from being more than it absolutely has to be.
Mark, how about you? What risk or threat are we perhaps overlooking?
Yeah, from my perspective, you know, I'm always optimistic that there's a lot of lessons learned that'll get applied that will make the world better. I actually am very worried about all of the doctor visits that haven't happened over the last 8 months and the unintended effects on the health of the population because of that. Cancer doesn't wait because, you know, of a pandemic, and these things. Getting people back to the doctors and the more routine health checks, I'm very worried that this is going to have a much more profound impact on the population going forward. So that's been top of mind from my perspective.
Okay. And Martin, what's on your mind?
I mean, I'd echo everything that the other speakers have said, Barney, but what's on my mind, my biggest fear is that we don't learn from this. My biggest fear is that, you know, everybody said, you know, we miss the opportunity to change the picture moving forward. And it all comes down to where must we invest now or pay later. So it's all, words are one thing, actions are completely different. So what I'm fearful of is the words not being translated into action, in particular where we need to be investing money to ensure this doesn't happen again. Investment in public health systems, investment in research and development with a focus on innovation targeted towards prevention, and solid cash put into a global emergency response, global surveillance systems, global track and trace systems, and global investment in institutions, non-governmental institutions, to hold our governments accountable so that we're not sat here in 5, 8, 10 years' time, because those bugs are sat out there.
Absolutely, absolutely. And finally, Yvonne, to you, is there any particular threat or risk that you think we're in danger of overlooking?
Please don't forget inequalities that have arisen here that have been augmented. That is the terrible price to pay. But on an up note, I think it would be wonderful if we spotted the economic opportunities that we've learned about during this pandemic and we moved to a greener economy.
Great. Well, with that, we're going to wrap things up. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to the audience, especially those who submitted questions. To people watching on ft.com and LinkedIn, you can follow the rest of the sessions on the website globalboardroom.ft.com. And on that same site, you can find a recording of this session. So thank you all. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to the FT studio.
Well, thanks so much, Barney. Very interesting panel discussion. Very good also to be able to reach additional audiences on LinkedIn and ft.com for this session as well. I think what was really striking there was just to hear all of those experts who, by the way, have been spending the entire year right at the coalface of this pandemic. So interesting to hear all of them issue a big health warning about the exciting vaccine news this week. As Martin Lush from NSF said, that it's great news, but it should have come with a lot of very big buts. Each of them pointed out that not only will it require 2 doses, not only will it be quite tricky to distribute, also governments are just not going to be able to distribute it evenly to everybody. They're going to have priority lists. So although it's very exciting, it's going to take some months. In fact, Anders Tegnell from Sweden was suggesting that it could take, I think, 6, 7, 8 months before before things really are able to be moving back to a more even keel in Sweden. Also interesting to hear from Anders Tegnell, who of course has been right at the forefront of Sweden's efforts to tackle the virus, sometimes quite controversial ones, because they've avoided some of the toughest lockdowns that we saw amongst their neighbours in the rest of Europe and elsewhere in the world. He's sticking very much to that strategy, although he's saying, we adapt all the time. We do make changes, but he's really, I think he's not conceding that there have been problems with that at all. And he thinks, I think, that by the time we reach the end of the pandemic, his strategy will be very much be seen to have been the correct one. Perhaps not so surprising. Just finally, also just really interesting to hear all of them talk about what we can expect next and where the next pandemic might in fact come from. So with that, I would just like to say that please do stick around. We have Gillian Tett next. She will be moderating a special moral money panel on building back better. So please stick around.
Hello there. personal. And down they go.
Welcome back. Now, the FT's Moral Money newsletter has become a must-read for anybody interested in sustainable finance or ESG, or indeed the rising calls for a different type of capitalism, one that cares more about the long-term welfare of the planet and its residents and less about short-term profits. The founder of Moral Money and the chair of the FT's US editorial board is Gillian Tett, and she's going to be moderating our next discussion. And that discussion is going to look at what needs to happen for businesses around the world to build back better after the pandemic. There are three words that we have all come to know and hear very often throughout the year. So on the panel, we have Jim Fittling, the Chief Executive of Dow, which is the global leader in material science solutions, and guests from three of our global boardroom partners. Takeshi Minami is the Chief Executive of Global Consumer Products Group Suntory Holdings. Andrew Morley is Chief Executive of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which promotes the idea of a circular economy. And Jay Rosen is the Chief Financial Officer of the Red Sea Development Company, a very large tourism development project. And remember, we are expecting plenty of interaction on social media. So if you would like to participate online, please do use the hashtag FTGlobalBoardroom, or to get directly involved in the debate. It's quite simple. You simply submit questions and comments via the box on the right of your screen. And Gillian will be doing her best to put them to the panel. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
With finite materials.
We are throwing an awful lot of electronics, plastic food, carpets, clothing away. It's a waste of precious materials.
If we could build an economy that would use things rather than use them up, we could build a future that really could work in the long term.
and welcome to the next session of the Financial Times' Global Boardroom event. My name is Gillian Tett, and I'm delighted to be moderating a session to discuss the climate emergency, the sustainability agenda, and what businesses could and should do, and whether that is enough. And in many ways, the timing for this session couldn't be better, because in the last 24 hours, we've already had a series of very striking bits of news. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor for the UK, stood up and said that essentially not only is the UK going to start issuing green sovereign bonds, but also, perhaps even more importantly, it's going to be asking companies to implement something known as TCFD, an ugly mouthful, which basically means a task force for climate-related financial disclosures, which is going to force companies to come clean about their environmental footprint. On the other side of the Atlantic, we have endless speculation about what President-elect Joe Biden could or should be doing, presuming he gets into the office smoothly in January. And just this morning, Mike Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, who's played a leading role in trying to champion private sector moves on climate issues, has come out with a strong op-ed with some words of advice about what Joe Biden should be doing in the months ahead. So lots of things moving, and that's even before we get to things like COP, which will be happening next year in the UK. So we have a fantastic group of people to talk about this. We have two leading CEOs. On the one hand, we have Jim Fitterling, who's talking to us from Middle America. He's chairman and CEO of Dow, a chemicals giant. On the other side of the globe, we have Takeshi Ninami, who is chief executive officer of Suntory Holdings, who uses a lot of products from the chemical industry and elsewhere, and is also playing a very interesting role in the whole environmental debate. We have Jay Rosen, who's CFO of the Red Sea Development Company, who's talking to us from a place I think many of us wish we were right now. It looks like a gigantic holiday resort in its backdrop. But that's no accident, because he is a part of a group that's trying to create sustainable tourism in the Middle East, backed by money from local sovereign wealth funds. As and when we can all travel again, let's hope it's soon, I'm sure many of us would like to be seeing some sustainable tourism. And last but not least, we have Andrew Morley, who's CEO of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is one of the NGOs promoting the idea of a circular economy, a sustainable economy. So I should say, first up, it's pretty amazing that you're all on the same panel. If you dial back 10 years ago, that might not have happened. And what's even more amazing is that you are sandwiched between Justin Trudeau and Reed Hastings, which indicates just how much interest there is in these topics right now. There was a time when doing good, sustainability, was something that people did at conferences but chucked to the end of the agenda because it was seen as a bit of a must-have in terms of signaling, but not actually that important. Right now, you are on a par with Reed Hastings and Justin Trudeau. So let's ask what is actually happening. And I should say, by the way, that the reason why I'm moderating this panel is because the FT, as indication of the importance of these issues, the FT a year and a half ago created a platform called Moral Money. If any of you haven't seen it, do please log on, because we are the first big media group to be tracking these issues day in, day out in a really comprehensive fashion, looking at it through the financial prism. But let me start with you, Jim. Company like Dow has been the target of environmentalists for many years. You're seen as being part of the problem in terms of plastic waste, in terms of chemicals, in terms of so many aspects of environmentally damaging activities. And yet you're now trying to tell people that you are part of the solution. Tell us how, and tell us really what's prompted you to come about with that change.
Morning, Gillian. Thanks for having us on today. You know, we've been working very closely with the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, as you mentioned. And we've got a very robust sustainability report out on Dow.com, which outlines our entire footprint. And I think, like any energy-intensive industry, which we are, we're faced with the challenge of trying to reduce CO2 emissions and try to tackle climate change. And climate change is really the key. Global warming, we can see, is already underway. it's going to get worse unless we find some real solutions. And that impact is going to be felt across the board. It's going to be more floods, worse storms, harsher droughts, straining food supplies. But, the other challenge is that those people who are already at risk in a lower socioeconomic status are going to be the ones that are going to be hit the hardest. And that's why we chose to accelerate some goals earlier this year. We've had a strong track record for the last 3 decades of driving sustainability goals. In fact, in the last 10 years, we were able to reduce our net carbon emissions by 15%. And we set a target by 2030 to do that again, and then by 2050 to be carbon neutral. That's a pretty stretched target for a company like us. I would say we have a very good path forward. I could almost walk you through individual projects at locations on how we could get to carbon neutrality, or how we could get to the 15% reduction by 2030. Carbon neutrality itself is going to take some technological breakthrough. It isn't going to be easy, and new technologies have to be piloted and scaled up, and we're working on some of those right now. The other thing I think that people have to bear in mind is that this is all about an energy challenge. And so you can't do this without some very intelligent energy policy and some other public policies that go along with it. So it's great to have accountability from a TCFD standpoint out there. And that's one part of the equation, but you also got to have some incentives and programs that drive you to the next generation. And I'll use an example of alternative energy. In these reductions to get us to a 15% reduction by 2030, alternative energy can play a role in that. But at some point in any energy intensive industry, it could be steel, cement, glass, aluminum manufacturing, ourselves. In any energy intensive industry where you work 24/7 and you've got to have available dispatchable power, you can't have any interruptions. And alternative energy for us, once we get to about 15% of our total use as alternative energy, we don't have the reliability of power that we need. And we really need for power and steam both. And so we have to look at alternative technologies. On the energy generation side, that's one part of it. And then the other part is on CO2 capture. And if you try to think about a power plant or a big chemical plant, if you try to capture all the stacked gas, the flue gas off of one of those plants, imagine all the ductwork and the capital and everything you'd have to try to put in to capture that very minute concentrations of CO2 and get it out. We really have to come up with some combustion technologies and other technologies that can allow us to reduce that pretty dramatically on the front end. So that takes pilot programs and time and scale. So we're working right now in the European Union and the Netherlands to try to come up with some technologies on that end to make one of our sites in Terneuzen one of the first carbon neutral sites that we'll have. So I think that's the big objective. And then on plastics, as Andrew knows, we've worked with Ellen MacArthur Foundation for a long time and view them as really the leaders in designing for circularity. And in fact, ourselves and many of our peers and many of our customers work with them. And what we're trying to tackle there is, just a long-standing tradition of having a linear economy where we use something and throw it away. And in a good case, it goes to a well-managed landfill, and in a bad case, it goes to an open dump and ends up in the ocean. To do that means we've got to capture those valuable products and upcycle them into something better. And we also have to design them to be able to be recycled in the first place, both of which are targets that we put out for our plastics division. We want by 2030 to enable 1 million metric tons of plastics to be gathered, recycled, and upcycled into new applications. And by 2035, because of the technology we've got to work on, we want to be able to make everything that we sell into packaging applications fully recyclable. And those two goals, I think, are going to help our brand owners and are going to help the country. But, recycling in and of itself also means infrastructure, and it also means consumer behavior changes. And it's got to be an all of the above equation. No company or country alone can do this. The problems are too big. We all have to work together to make it happen.
Well, thank you, Jim. Well, I think that was one of the messages very much from Mike Bloomberg in this morning's op-ed. But I can see we're getting some fantastic questions coming through already. Indicates the level of interest in this issue. Do send over some questions if you'd like. But I'd like to turn to quickly, before I do actually, Jim, quick yes, no answer. Do you currently report under SASB or TCFD or anything like that? Before I do
SASB as well. If you look at the sustainability report, it was audited third party under GRI principles.
Right. TAC, excuse me, I hope it's okay, Nanami-san, to call you TAC.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Now, Suntory is a big user of many plastic items, plastic bottles, all these kind of things. And of course, while you're making your products, you use a lot of energy. What are you doing to try and convince the world or investors that you are sustainable? And to what degree do you think Japan is lagging or leading in this respect on the world stage?
Thank you, Gillian. First of all, transparency policy, the foremost, I think definitely to communicate with our stakeholders. So we started to issue fact books, a fact book to our own stakeholders, talking about all the issues and sustainability accomplishments. And we set quite a bold goal in each area of CO2 emissions, water, and plastics, because we are using lots of water, as a global beverage company. And the CO2 emissions, we work with lots of supply chain players. Some of them are very much small and they can't afford. So they don't have resources to work with us, such as Scope 3, because they don't have any know-how to deal with the CO2 emissions. So I want to raise the issue of SMEs who are not resourceful enough. And we are now working with them by providing support so that they can work with us. So that's a very much important issue. Second, water. As I mentioned, we use a huge amount. That brought us to make a decision that we will be achieving net positive in water use by 2050. In doing so, we created the water sanctuaries to protect the forests, to preserve and regenerate natural water. And protect the forest means we have to protect the biodiversity as well. That's pretty important. We should not miss the issue too. And we started to educate children about the importance of natural water. So in doing so, we have 3 natural water natural water sanctuaries in Japan, US, and Europe, and some are on the way in Asia. And 3 are plastics, which is the most important nowadays. This is a huge change because of COVID-19. People got to know its importance. It's essential for our life, such as to protect us from a pandemic. We use face shields, we use panels to block between people, right? So it's essential for our life. It was regarded as evil before COVID. But a key thing is we have to use plastics correctly by recycling. So key thing is technology. We have 2 technologies which we invested to. One is to use bio chips totally to shift from fuel-based to bio-based to reduce emissions, CO2 emissions. And the second technology which we invested to is to make components to produce plastics from used plastics. So both technologies are so important. And now we decided to build plants using those technologies in Japan, working with the across industries. So not more than, not only by ourselves. Partnering is very important. That's another key issue. And we have a bold plan to make use of that technology in ASEAN countries, because Asia is related in the sustainability issue because they are growing using a lot of CO2. So all in all, two things. One is partnering, two technologies. So going to your second question, as Japan, we have to make a roadmap to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Though key issue is what to do with the rulemaking in sustainability, because we can't join the EU rules like 01 taxonomy. That's the key issue we have to discuss globally.
Right.
So we are ready to talk about that.
Thank you. Well, one of the fascinating details, and in some ways quite unexpected details, but what's been happening in the last year that we've written about on Moral Money a lot is that Japan actually has a lot more companies reporting under TCFD than either the UK, although Mark Carney actually first launched these principles, or let alone the US, which in many ways has been a laggard in that respect. Tak, do you report under SASB or TCFD?
Yeah, TCFD. We joined and signed to work on it.
Right.
Yeah, so many companies are now working with a lot of accounting firms so that we can accomplish our goals together. And we are working together. We are working, helping each other.
Right. Well, I must say, when I used to cover credit derivatives, I used to joke there wasn't a sector I could imagine with more acronyms. And I've now discovered it. The green world is full of these acronyms, it's alphabet soup. As you look at all these initiatives to help with reporting. But Jay, I'd like to turn to you from a very different perspective. You are trying to build a sustainable tourism company, but in the part of the world, the Middle East, which has historically seemed very uninterested in sustainability issues, given the dominance of fossil fuels. Tell us what prompted you to do this and why local sovereign wealth funds are funding you now.
Sure. So, thank you for that, Jillian. His Royal Highness, recognized the reliance on fossil fuels and fossil fuels was short-sighted. And the kingdom released their Vision 2030 plan several years ago, which, among other things, looked at diversifying the country away from oil and fossil fuels. There are a number of projects across the kingdom underpinning Vision 2030 that will just do that. Tourism is one way to do that. We're undertaking a development project along the Red Sea coast that will not only transform Saudi Arabia, but tourism. And it's all built around sustainability. Tourism historically has gotten a bad rap. Degrading their environment. Look at Venice. Look at Maha Beach, the famous beach that was inspired and showcased in the Leonardo DiCaprio film, The Beach, where got great fanfare and was destroyed by tourists for degrading the environment and subsequently had to close. What we've recognized is that nature and the environment is our most is our most precious asset. I was reflecting on the title of our panel, Moral Money. It wasn't long ago that moral money would have been considered an oxymoron. Yet here we are today talking about the environment, sustainability, and biodiversity. And I think the interesting part is when you look at tourism as a way to contributing to sustainability in the environment, it's such a diverse ecosystem where it includes construction, development. It includes investors and capital, mobility, energy. And so we're really looking to push the boundaries of sustainable development. Sustainable development is the status quo. And there's been a proliferation of sustainable development. But we're looking to push the boundaries and focus on regenerative development. So how can we not just preserve and protect the environment, but enhance the environment? And is there a cost associated with that? Of course there is. However, the opportunity cost of not doing something is far greater if we're destroying the environment that our business and our industry relies on. And that's why, we're positioning ourselves as a company to be focused on sustainable development, but as a project as well. And so that's why when we set targets, not just to be free of single-use plastics, to be reliant on 100% renewable energy, we're taking it a step further. We want to be carbon neutral. And how can we enhance the conservation value of our environment and our project? At the end of the day, is there a cost? Of course there is. But at the end of the day, we believe there's an ROI associated with that, given where the demand shift is taken amongst consumers and tourists. People today want to travel with purpose. They want to travel responsibly. And so as a unique selling proposition, if we can offer a destination where they can connect with nature, connect with the environment, we think there's a value proposition where we can generate a return on our investment.
Right. Well, thank you. Well, I should say, by the way, that the reason we called it moral money, just to go this moral money, is that we weren't trying to preach to anyone. We weren't trying to sound religious or anything like that. We were actually trying to invoke the theory of moral sentiments, which was the other half of Adam Smith's great two-part book setting out his theories about how markets and business should work, which is you need a shared moral, ethical, legal framework and a sense of society and context, stakeholder vision, not just shareholders. But anyway, Andrew, I want to come to you last because you just heard a lot of very striking pledges from people in business. If you're being cynical, you could say that this is part of the new PR spin about trying to do good. If you're being optimistic, you could say actually there has been a big shift in the zeitgeist. Where do you stand? Are you feeling optimistic or cynical right now when you hear about this? And is this enough for what groups like you are calling for in terms of a shift towards a circular economy?
Thank you, Gillian. I think that I would say I am optimistic. The discussion that we're having really is around the role of industry as a solution, as being part of the solution. And we absolutely agree that that is an essential part of the equation. We need to have the innovative drive and the ability of industry to actually implement and scale global solutions at pace that are commensurate or equivalent to the nature of the challenges we're facing. So we actually think that the industrial machinery is super important in scaling global solutions and driving innovation. And what we've spent the last 10 years doing is working with leading companies on that agenda and saying, how do we orient industrial innovation and the competitive possibilities, the scaling possibilities of these solutions to actually deliver better outcomes. And as Jay said, it's these days, it's much more about, a positive contribution to natural systems and to a system that's building natural capital rather than one that is extracting value and creating all sorts of collateral damage to the process. And, the linear economy, as we describe it, has been the force that has enabled a huge amount of wealth creation, but it's got an enormous amount of problems with it in that it does produce masses of pollution, and a lot of that is accumulative, persistent, very, damaging pollution, whether it's climate or oceans, plastics, as examples. But you can also look at the food system and the way in which we're, damaging topsoil and, we're creating cheap food, but we're actually destroying the basis of our future creation of food. So there is an awakening and I think an enlightenment sort of emerging that industry needs to be creating
viable natural systems, regenerating natural systems, having a net positive contribution to these challenges in order for the economy to work in the long run. And this is about value creation and building, restoring and regenerating natural systems as a byproduct of the core business. So given that, I'd come back on a few things. One is that, you know, when we talk about climate change and we talk about the nature of the challenge, this isn't just an energy challenge. This is a core business challenge. This is the way in which we produce and use and consume things. So that's about half of the challenge, in fact, and we've done quite a lot of analysis with world-leading companies and researchers, you know, showing that just by addressing the climate agenda through renewable energy and energy efficiency alone only gets us halfway there. The other half has to come through changing the business models and putting in place regenerative, restorative, circular economic models that keep materials in use and in flow and regenerate natural environment, natural systems as a byproduct of the business we do. Right. So that, you know, that's the shift we have to get to. And the other thing is that, you know, when we talk about the circular economy, many of the companies and organizations, and we work with, you know, 1,800 businesses around the world in our network, and we have more than 20% of the global production of plastics on the global market working with us on a common agenda for a system that works. Because, you know, TAC was correct. We need plastics as an important part of the economy, but we need it in a system that works and isn't leaking and damaging the environment or contributing to climate. And plastics alone contributes 20% of the 1.5 degree target by 2040. So it's a big deal. And we're never going to recycle our way out of this problem alone, because the growth of the demand, the growth of the production over the next several years, you know, the industry is investing $200 billion in putting new plastics capacity in line that is going to swamp the ability of the collection infrastructure and recycling. So we will, you know, we're on the pathway to a tsunami of plastics waste, you know, on business as usual. And we definitively know now that we have to take roughly 50% of the forecast growth of plastics out of the plan. And we have to do that by innovating with different models for reuse, for product service, you know, product delivery systems. And the remaining plastics that we do put on the market, we have to invest hundreds of billions of dollars into collection infrastructure so we can recycle it. So it's not enough to say that we're just producing recyclable plastics. They actually have to be recycled in practice at scale globally. They have to be recycled, not just recyclable. So, right. I mean, those are sort of my reactions. But I would say that, you know, we are seeing a really big shift. We're seeing this focus on metrics now being really important. The TCFD and other metrics out there are super important. We need to see that play out in the real economy measurement of circular economy as well, so that we can track not only the energy reduction, but the shift in production and consumption.
Right, that's fascinating. Of course, we are seeing alongside the TCFD, yet another ugly acronym emerge called the TNFD, which is the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And we are trying to give some clarity to this alphabet soup in moral money, because it is very confusing, but incredibly important. Yeah. We have a huge number of questions. I mean, frankly, we could obviously have 4 more panels on this. It's an indication of the interest among the FT readers. But I'm going to sort of pull a few together and start directing them one by one to you. And I'd like to start with you, Jim, because we've had a couple of questions asking how damaging has been President Trump's administration's stance on this in terms of action on climate? And from a corporate perspective, how quickly do you think it's going to change, or is it going to change under a potential President-elect Biden administration going forward?
It hasn't been tremendously damaging from our perspective. If you look in some areas, like we're working on things like controlling flaring emissions and other things. The EPA under the Trump administration was very aggressive on those types of issues and water discharge. So on clean air and clean water, they were pretty aggressive. There were some headline areas where they backed off of some things like fugitive methane emissions. But I would say overall, we still saw forward movement in terms of the Trump administration on clamping down on that. I think there's a lot of talk in the new administration about joining Paris on day one. And I would tell you there are a lot of American businesses that are already signed on to the Paris Accord, including Dow. And so I think joining on to Paris on day one is not to me, I don't view that as a tremendous cost to American business. But what we have to do with Paris is we have to make sure that everybody globally is signed on and everybody's playing by the same rules and it's a level playing field. Otherwise, what we do is we just export the linear economy model that Andrew talked about to other developing countries, and we move the carbon problem elsewhere, and we call that carbon leakage. So I think as we move forward, I think there will be more emphasis on this, but we have to do it in a smart way, and we have to do it in a way where the whole world is working toward the goal of bringing down CO2 emissions.
Right. Just pick up another question. I'd like to ask this both to Jim and to TAC. Carbon tax, carbon price, carbon tax, carbon dividend, whatever name you want to give it. Would that be something that the Biden administration could introduce and maybe alongside the European Union administration, perhaps the Japanese, which would help? I'd love to hear your view, Jim, and then I'll ask TAC about that.
Well, I think to address the challenge, and so even though Andrew's right, it isn't totally just an energy challenge, but to address it from an energy standpoint and get to this combustion emissions part of the CO2. So, buildings, transportation, power generation, and industry make up the vast majority of that. In order to get that carbon reduction out, the first thing you have to look at is we're doing things the most economical way possible today. So you don't want to continue the current status quo. So you've got to create a system that incentivizes the capital markets to want to come in, to put money to work, to reduce that CO2 emissions, and to change, where the profit driver is in this equation. So you've got to have something that sets a value for that CO2 emissions reduction. So a lot of times we'll talk about carbon tax or emissions trading schemes to make that happen. And in Europe today, there are emissions trading schemes that do that. We've talked in the US of having cap and trade schemes, which is both putting regulation on and trading systems on to allow the markets to come in and be part of that. So I do think it's part of accelerating this. Now, the problem is bigger than just a small carbon tax. So, a $20 carbon tax is not going to drive the kind of technological change that we're talking about to solve this problem. It's going to take more than that in terms of incentive to get the capital markets to put money in there to solve the problem.
Yeah, well, I think the IMF has talked more about a $70 one or even higher, which would be certainly quite a shock to the system. But Tak, I'd like to ask you, give us any thoughts you have on a carbon tax or carbon price. But I'm also curious, we got a great question, which is very relevant to Suntory, which is, what role do you see for major companies with global supply chains and customers to become proactively involved in addressing the SDGs in low-income countries, given the role of large Japanese corporations with big supply chains across, say, Southeast Asia, which of course is one area of focus. I'm curious on your thoughts about that. It's not just about SMEs in Japan, it's about SMEs across the supply chain in Asia.
Right. We are now working on the ASEAN countries, for example, so that we can provide some kind of aid in technology, such as a recycling model, ecosystem, and circular economy needs the technology. So, for example, we are now thinking to work with the TPP 11 countries so that we can resolve the issues of sustainability. And just like the EU taxonomy, Asian countries can't follow. So we Japanese corporations and the government want to have a dialogue to have the rule making among the ASEAN countries so that things can be real, because ASEAN countries can't catch up on the current pace of reduction of CO2 at this moment. So first of all, technology. Second, such as plastics, how to provide collection systems in those countries where we have in place in Japan, how we can work with the NGO, NPOs, local, and the universities and civil societies. But problem is the local governments tend to put the restrictions or regulations all of a sudden. Yeah. It's not good because, for example, plastics are needed as we are talking about. So we have to work, government, and corporate, so that we can set up an ecosystem, circular economy in those emerging economies to fit their status, to evolve with the reality. That's what we Japanese corporations and the government are working with ASEAN countries.
Right. Well, I must say, it is striking, the issue of plastics really cuts to the core about both behavioral change. Can there be behavioral change? I used to live in Japan, and I remember things were wrapped at least 5 times before you could actually get it because of this deep respect for cleanliness, and that's going to be an issue of cultural change, not just in Japan, but elsewhere. But I'm curious, Andrew, I'd like to turn to you. I mean, we got a question. Would it help if there was simply legislation nationally or globally simply imposing circular economy standards on companies? Is that what needs to be done? I mean, do you think that voluntary measures are going to be enough, given that in a place like Japan, you have local governments who may not be on board and create very contradictory signals for companies?
Well, I think it is, a combination of these things. First of all, just commenting on the consumer behaviour agenda, you can't get people to change their behaviour against a system that's working against them. I mean, what we actually need is industrial innovation to provide better options for people that they will buy because they're easier to use, they're convenient, they're well priced. So the innovation agenda is really crucial. So again, you need to have the industrial innovation, but you've got to have the policy frameworks as well. And what's interesting about plastics is that it's really very clear now after 5 years on this topic intensively with the world's leading organizations that it does boil down to a few very fundamental universal things that we need to be doing everywhere. We need to be, policy needs to be looking at how we can actually reduce the volume on market everywhere. It's just really clear we can't keep up with the volumes and the forecast growth. We need to be able to get things like EPR, extended producer responsibility, so the producers are funding partially the infrastructure that's needed to collect and recirculate the plastics that are in the system. And we need policies that actually start to eliminate the plastics that we just can't see a path in any way, shape or form, an economic path for their ability to be kept in the system and out of the natural environment. So things like sachets, small format straws, the pieces that will never be collected and taken back. So we absolutely need innovation and industry leadership, and there are many very good examples of strong company leadership now, people who are absolutely committed to being part of the solution. And we need regulation to help provide a context for global innovation, because this is a global challenge. And we need regulation that actually helps to create better markets and better flow.
Right. Jay, I mean, we're running short of time, but I'm curious, I'd love to hear from you. Has COVID-19 derailed your initiatives in any way, given that people can't travel, given that fossil fuel prices collapsed to a point where someone like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia may be facing problems in terms of having as much free cash flow to invest in these kind of innovative projects? Do you think COVID-19 has changed the appetite for this?
No, I'm happy to address that, but if it's okay, I would like to go back and address the last discussion point between Tak and Andrew on the role legislation plays. Absolutely agree with what both Tak and Andrew were just saying. The regulatory environment certainly plays a role. In fact, that's something that we've recognized very early on. So, in the critical role and its importance. So, we've been designated as a special economic zone where we get to create our own regulatory environment. whose core and key principles is to preserve and protect the environment. So, we're hoping to use the framework that we're establishing within our SEZ as a showcase to the world, and perhaps then, it can be expanded to, outside the kingdom and outside the region, something to adopt across the world if we're successful in establishing these guidelines and it's proven to be success. As for your question as it relates to COVID, do I see it impacting us here in the kingdom? Absolutely not. In fact, as I mentioned before, Vision 2030 was all about diversifying the economy here. With COVID now, it's become much more irrelevant than it was before. Diversify the country and the economy away from oil and fossil fuels, given the impact that COVID has had on the global market. So we've been prioritized to push forward and push ahead. We're under construction, committed several $1 billion worth of work, and we're on target to welcome our first guests at the end of 2022.
Right. Well, thank you very much indeed. Well, apologies to all of you who couldn't get to the questions. We've had an absolutely near record tsunami of questions from the audience, more than 50 in the space of a few minutes, which indicates just how interested people amongst the FT readership and audience are in these issues, which reflects a bigger change in the zeitgeist amongst the business and financial community. I put it down, amongst other things, to the fact that COVID-19 has shown us three things. Firstly, that we do live in a globally interconnected world, and when the weakest link in the chain of humanity snaps, we all suffer. Secondly, it's shown that science cannot be ignored without terrible consequences. And thirdly, it's shown that behavioral shifts can actually happen. Who would have believed that New Yorkers, where I live, would have all been wearing masks just 8 months ago, and yet everyone is now. And there are so many ways that COVID-19 has acted as a wake-up call, which obviously plays into this debate, because not only does it show the role of biodiversity in shaping our futures, given that this is a zoonotic disease, but it also shows, as I say, the danger of ignoring science. So I'd just like to say a very big thank you to all of you for taking part in this very interesting panel. Although we couldn't get to the questions, we will be covering these topics exhaustively in Moral Money in the coming weeks and months. I'd like to say a particularly big thank you to both Jay and to TAC for, Jim and for TAC for spending time out of their busy schedules to give us a sense of the corporate perspective, because in many ways, that is one of the things that's changed significantly in the last year. And also to Jay for giving us a perspective which many of us wouldn't normally have about the role that the Saudi kingdom has in trying to put this on the map at a time when it's often been thought that fossil fuels is the only thing that people are talking about in the region. But last but not least, thank you to Andrew for casting this in a wider perspective as we go forward. And it just remains for me to say, please do keep sending in your thoughts. We do want to engage with people, and do please keep reading as well. So on that note, I'm going to hand back to Polita to take us forward for the next session in this conference.
Well, welcome back, and thank you, Gillian. That really was a great discussion. So interesting to hear so many chief executives and CFOs from so many interesting and large companies involved in, often in plastics and chemicals production in the case of Dow. Also a company like Suntory, a beverages company that uses a lot of plastic. Because, of course, one of the big questions we have in this area is how we don't just recycle plastic, but actually reduce our consumption of it. Very interesting to hear the chief executive of Suntory say that he thought the pandemic had actually been great for plastic's reputation, and before the pandemic, it had been seen as a bit of an evil, was the word that he used. But since then, he made the point that actually now that we're all using plastic shields and plastics being used in so many products to do with testing kits and other aspects of life that we've become used to, that actually people are starting to see how important it is. But against that, also just so interesting to hear from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation chief executive about how we have have to look beyond just recycling. And as he said, we're not going to recycle our way out of the great environmental threats and crises that we're at risk of facing. We actually have to do something about the growth of plastics production. And actually, I think the figure he used was that there's something like $200 billion is being poured into increasing production. And if that continues, if we still have, if we go along with business as usual, that is really going to make it difficult to achieve the goals, the laudable goals that a number of people are aiming for. And indeed, perhaps even the goals that the companies themselves there have been talking about. So before we move on, I just want to take a moment to encourage you to visit our global gallery on the Global Boardroom website. You will find artworks there inspired by FT content. And there's also a chance to win one of 10 lifetime subscriptions to the FT. So do please check that out. Okay, coming up next is our climate change panel. See you shortly.
Of the FT Energy Transition Strategy Summit will focus on the multiple forces causing disruption in the industry. The event will be a unique digital experience covering a range of pressing topics, including mapping a sustainable pathway to net zero, hydrogen, and how to overcome the high costs, offshore wind, and more. So please join us on what promises to be an unmissable event for professionals in the energy industry. You will be in good company, joined by a stellar list of the very top industry peers and able to digitally connect with colleagues and clients from companies and institutions, including the UK Prime Minister's Finance Advisor for COP26, Mark Carney, BP, Equinor, ENGIE, the International Energy Agency, Trafigura, Statkraft, and many more. We look forward to seeing you then.
Well, as you can see, I closed my position on Japanese yen right here. I'll show you. Okay, so position closed on Japanese yen.
Welcome back. We are now going to build on our theme of building back better, as it were, with a session on what COVID-19 really means for the climate change agenda, and in particular efforts to meet net zero carbon emission targets by 2050. A lot of people say that climate change presents an even greater risk than the pandemic, but our efforts to combat COVID-19 putting the fight for climate change on the back burner? Or alternatively, can the crisis be a trigger for renewed global efforts to reduce carbon emissions? As a former FT environment correspondent, I am very much looking forward to hearing the answers to those questions in this session. It's being moderated by Leslie Hook, the FT's excellent current environment and clean energy correspondent, and she's being joined by an excellent lineup of experts. We have Todd Stern, Chief Climate Change Negotiator in the Obama administration, Rachel Kite, Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts and former Special Envoy on Climate Change at the World Bank, Lynn Jurek, Chief Executive and co-founder of the very large solar energy company Sunrun, and Carlos Duarte, Chair in Red Sea Ecology at the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology. And thank you, by the way, to our partner for this session, the Red Sea Development Company. So this promises to be an extremely interesting debate. If you are watching and you feel the need to share your thoughts on social media, don't forget the hashtag is FT Global Boardroom. Stay with us.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever in the world you are. Welcome to the FT's Global Boardroom. Our panel is looking at how coronavirus will impact climate change and climate action. And I'm delighted to welcome 4 distinguished speakers. I'll just introduce them very quickly before we begin. Lynn Jurek is CEO and co-founder of Sunrun, the US solar company, which I believe is one of the largest residential solar groups in the US.
It is, and in fact, one of the largest owners of solar assets globally with 3 gigawatts now of power.
Thank you. So glad to have you here. Rachel Kite, Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts, and previously the Special Envoy for the UN Secretary General for Clean Energy. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, nice to see you, Leslie.
And Todd Stern is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he was the chief climate negotiator under the Obama administration. Hello, Todd.
Hi.
And Carlos Duarte is a professor of ecology at the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia. I'm so glad to have you all here. And I'm going to start by going to you, Rachel, to ask you to frame in a couple minutes whether you think this global pandemic will help or hinder climate action.
Well, the jury's out because this was an enormous wake-up call. This was a grey rhino charging towards us, i.e. a threat that we've been warned about. We've been warned of zoonotic pandemic threats. We've been warned about the climate threat. And so we have to learn something as society about why we don't get out of the way of these white rhinos when they charge towards us. I think it has reset the public's attitude around resilience. I think it has presented us with one enormous challenge economically. There is only now really one game in town. We have to engineer a global economic recovery, which does actually make economies more inclusive and makes them cleaner. So it's not that we have climate action in one hand and we have an economic recovery in another. I think the signaling from the IMF, from the UN, from around the world is that there's one game in town now, which is how do we engineer this recovery? But that's not what we're seeing yet in the recovery packages which are coming out of most countries. So I think there is a reset moment around resilience. There's a public attitude to climate change, which has been unwavering throughout the pandemic in the industrialized countries of the North. So it's too early to tell, but this is an enormous opportunity, one which we should have been able to prevent. Can we learn about how we need to be able to manage, build resilience and prevent the worst of climate impacts from this moment?
Yeah, I think that idea of a reset moment is one we're probably going to come back to again and again. Lynn, how did things look from where you're sitting? I mean, you guys have still been growing this year despite the pandemic, despite it all.
Absolutely. I'll start big picture and then get a little more specific. Climate action is going to take huge change. And I believe that in order to create change, there's really a formula of discomfort times vision. And you need a big coefficient on both of those, ideally, to actually drive the change. And I think that, we're feeling the discomfort right now. And it's not just COVID, it's the political situation, it's race situation. And so I think that is a real motivator. And then you pair that with vision, with, the big aggressive targets that have been put out there with, companies like Sunrun that are really leading the charge on getting renewables and batteries deployed at speed. And I would say, getting back to my company, my experience specifically, we were really pushed to increase our corporate metabolism during this time. So we went immediately fast to digitizing everything that we do. We acquired the second largest player in our space for $3 billion, did it all remotely. We started a joint venture with SK Group in Korea to really advance electrification globally, particularly in the home. So I'm very, very encouraged. And then I would just, close with, again, the personal psychology of consumers really wanting to invest in their home, make it safe, make it resilient, to Rachel's point, I think is there. And we're seeing people use a lot more electricity, be home, and really want to invest in rewiring and electrifying their sanctity.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you guys have seen so much growth during this time. Todd, how do things look from your perspective? Do you think the pandemic will help or hinder climate action?
Well, I would say for starters, they look very different from the way they looked about 10 days ago or 8 days ago. So the election here has a potential to radically change what the United States is able to do and willing to do with respect to climate. Look, I think that I completely agree with what Rachel said. I think there's a potential for the COVID to make it harder because there is an obvious distraction in terms of public focus. The big existential threat that people are facing, they think less about climate right now than they do about COVID. But at the same time, I think that there's a potential opportunity, which often happens in a crisis, because you've got huge amounts that need to be spent for recovery to stimulate an economy which is in the United States and other places as well, but in the United States way down. So this opens the door to the kind of spending levels and the kind of engagement that isn't possible, at least politically, in ordinary times. So that opportunity is there. I think that the president-elect Biden is and his team are very focused on making that recovery green here. It needs to be, as Rachel said, it needs to be green all over. But I think that there's big opportunity. I think there's also I sort of think of three basic lessons that I think we can all learn from COVID, and that I think penetrate to the public to some degree, which is that science and facts matter, preparation matters, and that when leaders get their mindset changed about the essential nature of action, really extraordinary things can happen that nobody would have thought could have happened. I mean, nobody would have imagined before COVID that whole economies could be locked down, could be changed in short order in order to deal with a crisis. So those are lessons that would serve us well with respect to climate.
Thank you, Todd. And Carlos, you are an ecologist. Do you see any silver lining in the pandemic in terms of the damage that we're doing to our natural world and the rate at which we're emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere?
Well, definitely the pandemic has taught us a few lessons, and one of them is that we've all witnessed the decrease in the economy with the pandemic, particularly in the transport system. And when we translate that decrease in energy use and transport systems into avoided warming in the future, we realize that all of that we're seeing is actually only 0.01 degree of avoided warming by 2035. So we are now on course with the pledges in place to reach about 3.2 degrees of warming by end of century, and the target is 2 degrees or lower. So that means that the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions required is equivalent to 120 COVIDs, just to picture the magnitude of that effort. So COVID has actually been a perfect storm in some way, because it has hit the world in a time where we were finding it difficult to work together, and it also has distracted attention from climate action into addressing and mitigating the suffering of our fellow citizens under the pandemic. And it has been a wave of pessimism, but then leadership has emerged in terms of climate action for the most unlikely place, which is Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has been leading the G20 process this year and has made it a priority to have a process to discuss climate stewardship, and has been put forward a proposal of the circular carbon economy that embeds the way we manage carbon into a closed loop that avoids climate impacts and actually mimics the way that nature works, which I like, because that's how nature achieves climate stability. So that framework makes sense, and it's actually consistent with broader concept of the circular economy. So if we can have circular economies for plastic bottles, we can have them for carpets, we can have them for buildings, what about a planet? Isn't that an ambitious proposition? But that's really what is being discussed actually next week at the G20 Leader Summit in Saudi Arabia. And I believe it is a very engaging proposition for us to learn again to work together, because climate change is also a pandemic that requires us to work together and collaborate to mitigate the impacts in the future.
Thank you so much, Carlos. We do have the G20 coming up, and the G7 hosted by the UK. I want to go back to what Todd was saying about the US and what it will mean to have new leadership in the White House as President-elect Biden implements his vision, his plan for a climate-based stimulus. And Rachel, I'm going to come back to you. What sort of difference will it make in kind of bending the arc of emissions to have Biden in the White House?
Well, it's game on now, right? I mean, the race to net zero emissions by 2050, and yes, that is a long-term target, and yes, we need very specific action in the next 10 years, but having everybody agreeing, where the destination is kind of important. And so the race to zero was really enjoined in September and October with the announcement by President Xi Jinping during the General Assembly that China would aim to be net zero by 2060, coming off the back of a clarification from the EU about the ambition of their climate pledge, and that's around 55% reduction in emissions over 1990 levels by 2030, and the green sort of recovery that they have put in place. And then we had Japan making a similar net zero announcement, and then the Republic of Korea. And then we've seen other pieces of announcements coming together from different countries, and now a diplomatic effort to use the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement on December the 12th to sort of get people to ratchet up, which of course this was the year of ratcheting up. Now the US is going to join that race. And, the history of the United States is that when it joins a race, it tries to win. And so now we have a race to the top, potentially. It doesn't, there are lots of details. There's a huge effort for the Biden administration, because while there's a sort of a breathing out and a sort of relief, I think, from people concerned about climate around the world, the detail is important. And exactly what kind of specifics the US comes with on the back of its re-entry into Paris, which we expect very soon after the president-elect has been inaugurated, that's going to be very important. I think the world has sort of moved on a little bit, and so it's not as if nothing happened for the last 4 years. And I think there will be a look to the United States about what their specific commitments for the 2020s are going to be. But we have the potential for a race to the top around net zero. We need that diplomatic play between Beijing, Brussels, and Washington in order to make sure that everybody is speeding up the ambition and the action, and we can bring the laggards. Bring the laggards with us. There's no plausible deniability now. Nobody can hide under or behind the United States now. This is going to make life much more difficult for Bolsonaro, for Scott Morrison in Australia, and for those who have traded in climate denial for the last few years.
That's so interesting. And Todd, what does it look like to you? What do you expect from the Biden administration? He's just now naming his first officials of who's going to be advising on transition appointments and things like that. How do you think it's going to shape up?
Well, the President-elect Biden has made clear now, really since the Democratic convention, that climate is one of his really central objectives. He talked about COVID recovery, economic recovery, racial justice, and climate change as his sort of 4 guiding lights. That's very important, and I think that his administration is going to try to hit the ground running. I mean, obviously, I would be shocked if he didn't announce his intention to rejoin Paris on the first day. It takes about 30 days to get that done, but the U.S. will be back in the Paris regime quickly. working on a new NDC out to 2030 with, the challenge there of going as far as you possibly can at the same time as doing something that looks like you can credibly execute on it. But Biden signed up for net zero by 2050. He's talked about zero carbon power sector by 2035 and a whole slew of ambitious plans. It will be easier if we, God willing, we manage to win the 2 runoff elections in the Senate in Georgia and get control of the Senate. That's probably a long shot. Even without that, there will be, I think, a great deal that Biden can do, both by way of executive action and by way of working with at least a handful of Republicans who know that climate change is real and I think would be prepared to work with us. I think that my guess is that the rest of the world is going to be both eager and somewhat wary with respect to the United States. But in the first instance, wary of what could happen because they've seen it happen with Trump getting elected 4 years ago, but also eager to have the United States back because things just work better when there's in the world where there's an effort to do an important global initiative. It's just a lot better if the United States is fully engaged, and as Rachel points out, trying to, if not win, certainly drive the whole system forward. And I have every expectation that that's what the Biden team will be looking to do. And the core mission that we have to remember is different, obviously, than it was before diplomatically. I mean, before we were, under our Biden, the mission was to get an agreement done. That agreement got done. The mission now is for all of the major players and as many middle players as possible to sign on to the net zero and a 1.5 objective, and then to put an action plan in place to get there. So that's the game now, and I think the United States will be right in the middle of that game.
So a real note of optimism. And Lynn, does the climate plans of a Biden administration change the outlook for Sunrun in terms of what you guys will be doing? You are a U.S.-based company, of course.
Absolutely, and I'm here to talk about the action plan because I think we have it. So in addition to the political landscape obviously being much more favorable, 2 key technologies are now available that can make renewables proliferate. That's battery storage and that's electric vehicles. These are 2 new technologies that are rapidly coming down the cost curve and can completely reshape our energy system. And we know that energy is, 80% of carbon emissions. And so we have to electrify everything we can in our buildings and our transportation. And we need to power that with renewables. And so some very, specific ideas, accelerate the adoption of rooftop solar, accelerate the adoption of batteries sited with that solar, accelerate some of the rules that even PG&E has endorsed to say, let's eliminate natural gas out of the home. We don't need it anymore. The technologies of, of induction heating, of electric heating, of induction cooking are superior. I just look at even the forecasts, independent of Biden, even the forecast for battery deployment in California next year is enough to eliminate 10% of peaking gas plants. So what we're seeing now is just an energy system that's moving distributed. Those batteries can now be networked together and dispatched to eliminate polluting fossil fuel plants. So the faster that we can do that, and what we need to do is open up those markets. We have these, electricity markets that have been, typically monopolies. They're not, regulated to enable these distributed assets to participate. Our cars should store the energy and dispatch them. Our batteries are a more effective technology than these peaking gas plants. And the technologies are here and they're affordable right now. The math that we do shows that if a homeowner converts to fully electric with a vehicle powered by solar, they save $2,000 per year cost savings. If we had a big wartime effort in the US, that effort would create 25 million jobs. So talk about an economic recovery, and I think could allow the U.S. to really be an innovator and a leader. So we have some very specific ideas, and we look forward to working with the administration to affect them. Many of which, maybe we'll get to that, but many of which don't cost any money. Allow permitting reform. Allow standardization of building codes. Allow the batteries to actually interface with the system. These don't cost any money, and they're massive job creators.
Rachel, I see you nodding along there, and I want to just dive into a few of these points on clean energy, because we've just seen the IEA announce, I think yesterday, that clean energy is on track for record growth this year. What have we learned about renewables during the pandemic that we didn't know before?
Well, for all of the reasons that Lynn mentioned and more, they've proven to be the most resilient of all of the sectors in the energy economy. That isn't to say that there hasn't globally been, that they haven't taken a hit in terms of just investment because the economies are retracting and investors are perhaps showing a little bit more caution, but they've been much more resilient. We've seen huge convulsions in the price of fossil fuels, the oil price. This has sped up the wariness of the financial sector towards holding carbon assets for the long term. And so we've seen just a speeding up of money out of oil and gas and investor interest in clean energy. And it's solar and wind. And of course, just as there's lots of things that could be done to unleash the power of solar in the United States, Washington could lift its thumb and put it on the balance in a positive way for wind and offshore wind. And that would be extraordinarily important, especially on this side of the country where I'm sitting. So solar and wind have seen their investment hold up through the pandemic. It's also not a red state, blue state issue. I mean, in the first quarter of 2020, Florida installed more solar, I think, than California. And of course, Texas has held up with its investments as well, and it's spreading to Arkansas and elsewhere. So this is really, truly a win-win-win. And what's important, I think, is this point that the IMF and IEA made over the summer, which is that there are very clear and obvious things that can be done that would achieve the short-term immediate pain point, which is getting people back into jobs, getting the economy going, getting income levels up and supporting people and making communities resilient, and achieve that medium and long-term objective of bending the curve of emissions. So that's building retrofits and deep refurbishment. It's building out the infrastructure for electric vehicles. It's investing in solar and making sure both are distributed and grid connected. And then it's putting the R&D, and this is where a Biden administration is important from a US perspective, is putting the money back into green R&D. ARPA-E, +2, +3, or to the power of N, because we have a possibility for a green hydrogen economy. We have all kinds of other things which will come off the back of excess capacity or really robust capacity of solar and wind. So for all of those reasons, investor interest is high in renewables. It makes sense. It's more resilient. And if any sector of the economy is having a good year, then renewables is doing quite well.
And paired with that growth in clean energy that we're seeing in 2020, we've also seen the net zero commitments, which you've all alluded to, coming from China, Japan, South Korea, and the Biden administration is expected to announce one soon. And I wanted to shift the conversation to look ahead to COP26 and the UN climate talks, which have been delayed, will now take place next November. In fact, we would probably all be in Glasgow right now if it weren't for the pandemic. And Todd, I'm going to come to you first. What do you expect now from COP26? What could the next climate talks achieve given the new political landscape and given that the U.S. will be involved?
Yeah, so I think that there will obviously be a lot of pressure for countries to re-up their their targets. As a technical matter, there's only a few countries who are required to put in new targets for 2020, now pushed over to 2021. That includes the United States, a handful of islands, and Brazil might be one of those, which are countries that took on targets that were basically just covering from the period from 2020 to 2025. So this would be the time when we and a few others would be required to put in new enhanced targets for 2030. But all other countries are encouraged to take the targets that they have, which last until 2030, and improve them. So that's the way Paris worked. And I think in light of the fact that there has been a quite dramatic change, even in the few years from Paris, in terms of consensus of what people and scientists around the world think is necessary, mainly kind of kicked off by the big IPCC 1.5 report, which I think brought home in a way that had not been brought home for many, that 2 degrees isn't good enough. We really need to get to 1.5. At that point, I think you have tremendous increased focus and energy going toward that goal, and therefore the need for China, India, EU countries all over to increase their targets. The EU is obviously a leader here, as they have been so often. I think the thing that is going to be very important, very interesting to see with respect to China is whether the Xi Jinping announcement that Rachel alluded to, which is hugely significant for getting to net zero, to carbon neutrality, in his words, before 2060, whether that's going to translate into action, real action, strong action in this decade, which it has to in order for that 2060 target to be real, and has to in order for the world to have a chance for 1.5. The initial sounds out of China are actually not that encouraging in that respect. There have been some indications of an intention to be more kind of flatlined in the 2020s and then steeply go down 2030 and after that. But that's actually not good enough. And China also has very large plans on the books and sometimes actually in progress for building coal, both in China and on the Belt and Road. And those things, again, are also inconsistent with the chance for the kind of goal that the 2060 statement by Xi Jinping was meant to address. So I am very hopeful and not at all pessimistic on this, that the Chinese will also bring their ambition, their longer term ambition, into action in this decade, because that's really going to be hugely important.
That's so interesting. Yeah, how to marry up the longer term goals for 2060 or 2050 with nearer term targets, and what's happening in 2025 and 2030 seems to be the real challenge now. And Carlos, I wanted to come back to you as well. What do you see ahead for the climate talks next year and for COP26? Do you think we could see some near-term targets come in to match the longer-term ones?
Yeah, so in fact, I spoke of COVID as a perfect storm, but in fact, I think there's a silver lining also, because if COP26 would have happened now, as it was scheduled, I think that we would have seen very little encouragement to raise the ambition from the nations that already made their pledges, which were not good enough, and also for the nations that are yet to make their pledges. Last year, I participated in COP25 in Madrid, and the US delegation was a small door with a four-seat table inside. That was all, right? I think that we would have seen the same level of commitment and engagement this year in Glasgow. So the postponement of COP26 to next year is going to allow us to revigorate the conversation, raise the ambition. We are probably more aware of the magnitude of the challenge. Also, the stimulus packages that are being rolled and will be probably rolled also in the US with a focus on green and blue recovery are going to make it possible to raise the ambition as well. And I think that the prospect will probably be better next year than if we had COP26 this year in Glasgow. And that is a decisive milestone. So I believe we will actually look at the future with more optimism after COP in 2021 than we would have in COP in 2020. And also, I think we have realized that we don't have a global challenge. We actually have two, and the two global challenges are connected because there is an equivocal evidence that the pandemic actually is also an outcome of our destruction of biodiversity and forests. And that erosion of biodiversity is actually responsible for 20 to 30% of the accumulated greenhouses in the atmosphere. So we talk about renewables, energy, and so on. But remember that 20 to 30% is actually due to our damage to ecosystems. So as we rebuild ecosystems to protect ourselves from future pandemics, we have also an opportunity to decarbonize the atmosphere and recarbonize the biosphere and helping maybe with a third of the lifting that we need to do to achieve climate actions while we also restore ecosystems and biodiversity and make it healthier for us in the future. And also, I think that's part of the broken intergenerational contract that we have broken, and we are handing over a planet that is broken to the next generations. So we need to fix both the climate, but also biodiversity, so that our children can and grandchildren can aim at living better lives than we have lived.
Thank you so much. And to those of you in our audience, thank you so much for your questions. There's still time to ask questions. Feel free to type them in the box that you see in front of you. We've got lots of questions coming in, and I'm just going to turn to a few of them now. And I'll go through multiple questions in one go. So first round of questions is, what sanctions can we expect from the global community if countries fail to meet their Paris Agreement commitments? What if countries miss their targets? Todd, I think that might be one for you. And another question on, can local planning play a significant role in addition to state and federal planning? Lynn, I'll let you take that one. Let's start with those two. So Todd, question from the audience, what happens if countries miss their Paris targets?
So there are not sanctions or penalties under the Paris Agreement, and the truth is that is the case for a great many international agreements and international regimes. There are some cases where you find those, but not very many. The Paris Agreement was able to be put together because it was built on a kind of fundamental architecture, which is nationally determined targets of countries. So countries could choose their own targets, and it was not, there was no way that there could have been a compliance system built in that included sanctions and penalties. The way the climate negotiations work is you basically have to have everybody on board. So it's a consensus system. So you've got 195 countries or so. They've all got to say yes, and that was just not in the cards. So Paris is really built on a system of essentially of peer pressure and of countries not wanting to look bad in the eyes of their countries, of their publics, civil society, and so forth. So the short answer is no sanctions, but that's not unusual in the international sphere.
Thank you, Todd. And Lynn, what is the role of local planning in climate goals?
It's really essential, and it's one of the things I think that gets in the way of this wholesale change in the U.S. And I think all of these big targets are really important, but change is going to come from people. It's going to come from the kitchen table. We're going to have to emotionally get people involved in this. And yet we're sending a signal to them. We're making it so hard for them to adopt solar. We're making it so hard for them to upgrade their electrical panel. For example, we have built a software program funded by the DOE to have instantaneous permitting where the codes are already in there. And that funding's been held up to actually release that. We have to go AHJ by AHJ to get them to try to adopt it. They're underfunded, or they offer resistance. And if we, just to give you a fact, in jurisdictions where there's an instant permitting, we have 10x the adoption of solar. It is half the price to put rooftop solar on globally than it is in the US because of the patchwork permitting rules, that we have in place. So I think it's absolutely essential. And then, you get into the local transportation planning and again, the building codes, like this is how it has to change. And we need to have, some really top-down leadership, I think, to mandate some of these changes to attack this problem with the speed we need to.
Leslie, can I add one sentence to the sanctions question, which is that if you waved a wand and said you could have sanctions, the result would be much lower targets by countries all over the world because they would be afraid of the sanctions. So it actually would be completely counterproductive even if you could do it. Just wanted to get that out.
Yeah, and I guess what you were saying is also that there is a lot to lose if countries miss their targets because of the collective impact of.
No question about that, but literal sanctions would actually be counterproductive.
Yeah. A few more audience questions. I don't think we'll be able to get through all of them today, but we will try. Carlos, a couple of questions that I'm going to send your way. One is on dealing with single-use plastics. The pandemic has meant that single-use plastics use has risen, and what can we do about that? Another question also about considering biodiversity loss and climate change. Has biodiversity loss been overshadowed by the CO2 agenda? Carlos, over to you.
Thank you, Leslie. So on the first question, we were also going to phase out in many nations single-use plastics, and yet we found that single-use plastics have been extremely valuable in protecting ourselves from being infected with COVID. So PIE materials and equipment, and in fact we have increased the production of single-use plastic by 18%. So demonizing single-use plastics is therefore not the way to solve the problem. Is effective management and stewardship of that material. So we need to build that into a circular economy, but we also need to have a system that brings the recycling of those materials close to home. And for instance, the materials that have been in touch with, or potentially in touch with SARS viruses, they actually need to be combusted at about 1,000 degrees. So you cannot recycle them, you can only burn them, but at least they could be burned in small facilities in hospitals and either generate energy for the hospital or any other service. But we are really rethinking what do we do with plastics, and certainly demonizing single-use plastics for the uses that are essential is not really the pathway, but we need to reduce and reuse and recycle the plastics that we use in society that can be recycled, and we need to certainly have a good stewardship of those to avoid that they end up in the ocean, as well as avoiding CO2 to going in the atmosphere. So that is fugitive plastic, carbon, either plastic or CO2, that just creates trouble for all of us. And on the second question on biodiversity, in fact, I think that the pandemic, as I said earlier, had made us more aware of the importance of a healthy biosphere for our own well-being and health. And the two problems now, climate and biodiversity, are now linked. And the IPCC and the IPBES, which is the same process for biodiversity of a review, has actually started a process to look at the linkage and the synergy between addressing the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. So I'm actually working on one of the chapters of that assessment based on solutions. And through addressing the biodiversity crisis, we can actually address 30% of the effort of climate change mitigation that is required. Imagine that in the 1700s, we actually literally burned whales for energy. So the cities of North America and Europe were actually lighted with oil from whales. We have decimated whales not because we hunt them for food, but because we hunt them for energy. So wouldn't it be wonderful that this CO2 that is in the atmosphere that once was a whale is back to being a beautiful whale, and not only creating value for the oceans and biodiversity, but also sequestering carbon through the actions of whales. So we're working on that, and we believe that the potential of nature-based solutions to mitigate climate change is actually much larger than we thought, and it will generate benefits for society and a lot of local benefits for everyone.
Thank you. I think so. The linkages between health and climate have become even more clear during a year that's seen a pandemic and also record-setting temperatures and heat waves and things like that. We only have a few minutes left in our talk, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't turn now to the topic of climate finance. Global budgets are going to be stretched because everyone's been pouring money into economic recovery efforts. Rachel, you've mentioned the green recovery, the green stimulus. Is there also a risk that there won't be enough money to go around? Is there a risk that the coffers could run dry, and how can we find funds for climate finance in this sort of post-coronavirus world that we're facing?
Well, I think there's the political discussion around climate finance, which is going to be a tricky issue for the UK presidency and the host of the climate talks next year, because there is a role for the UK, rather than just sort of saying what the UK is going to do and having sort of whiz-bang announcements, that they will have to grab hold of what is the sort of political deal around finance. And then there's what's actually going on in the markets and what's going on in sort of amongst central banks and regulators around climate. And one of those is going at warp speed. That's the sort of regulatory discussion around climate. So in the last few years, and then very quickly in the last few months, you've seen more and more central banks recognizing the critical macro-potential risk that climate poses. You've seen some real leadership from the Bank of England, including the speech by Andrew Bailey earlier this week at the Green Horizon Summit, where he clearly indicated the timetable in 2021 for banks to be stress tested. There are a group of consulting organizations now that will be helping banks work through those stress tests. And that's going to catch all kinds of companies across Asia and Africa, as well as the UK and Europe, in a much more robust sort of explanation of how they're going to profit in a world where carbon has to be managed out of the economy, how they're going to manage their business through that. And of course, we've seen the disclosure that's come from the transparency framework that was ushered in over the last few years by the FSB. But what you also saw in Andrew Bailey's speech was that it was indicating that the UK understands in its G7 presidency and its chairing of COP26 that potentially the UK sees the need for a reset. So if we imagine that we know that in order to have economies that can take care of people and take care of the planet, we need to manage carbon out of those economies, then we can no longer be neutral about the way in which we manage fiscal and monetary policy to that end. You've seen signals from the European Central Bank that neutrality has to be understood in an era of decarbonisation. You're seeing very strong signals coming from Geeta Gopinath at the IMF about the need for expenditure in order to get out of this. And she's talked about a liquidity gap. And so her discussion around how we spend our way out of this crisis, a crisis caused by COVID, and that spending has to be investing in the green future, the green infrastructure, the green economy that Lynn was talking about. So we're seeing this extraordinary potential sort of movement of rethinking our economic levers with carbon clearly seen as a risk. And then we have a political problem, which is the people who didn't cause this problem are the ones that are suffering from it, and they are highly indebted. And so you would also expect to see some leadership necessarily from the UK around, will we have debt for climate swaps for sub-Saharan Africa? Will European central banks engage in a repurchasing scheme of African debt in order to allow African countries to invest in the green infrastructure they want? So some conditionality there. Are there a new generation of sovereign performance bonds? So there's some really, really big climate finance questions. And at the heart of that will be the transfer of resources from those who caused the problem to those who didn't, to help everybody make the clean transition.
Thank you so much. So on top of facing the pandemic and helping stimulate economies to recover from economic recession, there's also a lot of work going on to make sure that the funding will be there to help countries decarbonize their economies and move toward net zero. This has been a fascinating discussion. I'm afraid we have run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much to the panelists, Todd, Carlos, Lynn, Rachel. It's been terrific to have you here, and really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Leslie. That certainly did not disappoint, that session, particularly when it came to the central question of whether the pandemic was going to set efforts to cut carbon emissions back or not. Some terrifically interesting answers. I thought Lynn Jurek from Sunrun, this enormous US solar company, was so interesting, just pointing out that regardless of the fact that there was a Trump administration, that had decided to pull the US out of the Paris Agreement, earlier this year, during the pandemic, she managed to negotiate or finalise a huge acquisition, $3.2 billion acquisition of Vivint, the company's largest rival. And she also had some really interesting ideas, I thought, for what needs to happen next. Also, just very interesting there to hear from Todd Stern, President Obama's former chief climate negotiator, who helped to negotiate the Paris Accord. Interesting to hear him say, you know, it's great that China has set this 2060 net zero target, but it's not going to be so good if they continue to show signs of really not doing very much this decade, and then saving up all of their action until the 2030s and beyond, because as Mr. Stern pointed out, really what the science tells us is that we need to be acting now. And as others said, you know, we've seen some terrific signs of energy and action around the world, not least in the setting of these targets. But actually, when it comes to the action needed, it's going to be another thing. And so all eyes are going to be on Glasgow, the site of the next big UN climate conference this time next year. In fact, as Leslie said, we'd be there now if it weren't for that. Well, we're not, we're here. And next up, we will be looking at how the pandemic has increased concern about cybersecurity. Back soon. Welcome back. Well, lockdowns have triggered a mass shift towards remote working, as we all know, and that means that businesses have become even more dependent on the internet. Unfortunately, that is excellent news for hackers and other more sinister agents who prey on the vulnerabilities in our cyber defences. So it raises a big question. How can we deal with these extra risks? We have a great panel to look at this issue now. We have Deborah Peterson, who is the Deputy Director for Private Sector Critical National Infrastructure at the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre. Also, Ajay Bala, President of Cyber and Intelligence Solutions at global boardroom partner MasterCard. And Shafi Goldwasser, who's Director of UC Berkeley's Institute for the Theory of Computing. Your chair for this session is the FT's Chief UK Business Correspondent, Dan Thomas.
As the line between the real world and the digital dissolves, cyber and intelligence is at the heart of securing both. We're enabling individuals and societies to advance and prosper together, whether it's connected homes, intelligent vehicles, or new waves of technological disruption. The way people live, work, and do business is being transformed. That's why C&I is leading the way in advancing technologies like AI, cyber, behavioral capabilities, and digital identity. We're looking ahead, securing consumer trust, pioneering innovative platforms, and expanding into new sectors.
Good afternoon and welcome to the next session in today's packed schedule, looking at how cybersecurity is changing the pandemic era. This is a subject of keen interest to everyone who's been forced to leave the comfort and digital safety of their offices for a life beyond ready access to the IT department and corporate firewall. A remote workforce will likely be here to stay regardless of the speed of a vaccine, and companies and governments need to plan for a new world of work. The good news is that the rapid move to the home has accelerated long-term trends in cloud and digitization, which for many companies has been a remarkable success. But there'll be worries that things have happened too fast and without enough care. Coronavirus has also brought its own very specific threats, from nation states attacking others for an advantage in the development of vaccines, to cyber criminals dangling malware, ransomware, and phishing scams. The greater the fears among the public, the easier the targets for hackers looking to prey on the doubts and worries among a frightened and confused population relying more than ever on their home computers. There is a lot to talk about here, and we'll move on now to the session. Before we start, just a reminder that we'd like to get as many of you as involved as possible, and we will be taking Q&A near the end of the session. So please do send over your thoughts as we progress, and I'll build them into the conversation and come to you later on. But first of all, I'd like to ask Debs Peterson to start off with some thoughts about what the NCSC has seen over the past 6 months in terms of the changes in cyber threats, to give us a sense of where we are today. Debs, can you start us off, please?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Thank you very much for inviting me here today to talk to you. In terms of how it's looked over the last 6 months for us, I think the first thing that really sprang to mind, and you mentioned that that jump from 95% of the workforce in some companies moving to home working was how resilient our infrastructure was. So in terms of our digital infrastructure, there were certainly points where it felt like it got close, but I think we'd be quite proud of actually how we've moved to a world of home working, and our infrastructure has supported that, which is my particular interest at the National Cybersecurity Centre. The other thing we saw over the last 6 months is the change in cyber risk. The criminals, how quickly they pivoted into this space, the fake cures, the fake testing equipment, the fake PPE. Within 2 days, the furlough scheme being launched, what we saw is the scams and cyber criminals preying on people's fears. In March alone, NCSC took down more COVID-focused scams than any other scam. And in the US, they saw something similar as well. And although the overall level of crime didn't change, it very quickly pivoted into that COVID space. As you mentioned already, advanced persistent threat, our adversaries, their tasking changed very, very quickly into COVID. So what we saw is a focus on national and international institutions targeting research data and intellectual property. And as you can imagine, any nation state, that information, that data is priceless. And only recently, the APT 29 that we judged to be highly likely the Russian intelligence services, we called out as focusing on our vaccine industry. The NCSC pivoted its entire response onto the government's #1 priority, which is on COVID. We wrapped ourselves around the NHS in a more interventionist way than we've ever seen. We had to innovate in a way we haven't before. So what we did is developed new tradecraft in a defensive threat hunting space in the NHS. We have protected our vaccine research, mapped out supply chains, and that's how we spotted some of that activity. We identified new critical infrastructure that is specific to the COVID response, like ventilators, vaccines, but also food and distribution networks.